Imagine stepping into a grand palace where marble floors gleam like mirrors. Crystal chandeliers cast their dazzling light, and every movement is wrapped in the scent of imported perfumes. At first glance, you would believe this is the very definition of elegance and power. But behind the silk curtains and beneath the golden crowns lurks a hidden curse, a slow, invisible enemy carried not by invaders or assassins, but by the royal families themselves. Generation after generation, their pursuit of pure bloodlines twisted into something far darker. Today, we unfold one of the most unsettling truths of European history. The story of the women born into dynasties so obsessed with keeping power in the family that they sacrificed health, happiness, and even survival. These women, raised in palaces and dressed in jewels, paid the ultimate price for decisions made long before they were born. In this episode, we will uncover 5 chapters of their hidden suffering, each revealing how the glitter of royalty masked a dangerous legacy of inbreeding from the very beginning. Royal families believed that their power came from divine blood. To keep this blood pure, marriages were carefully arranged between cousins, uncles, nieces, and sometimes even closer relations. The logic was simple but deadly. If the crown must never leave the family, then the family must marry only itself. In Spain, Austria, and other great kingdoms, young princesses were raised with this destiny from birth. Their value was not measured by talent or intelligence, but by the purity of their lineage. The church often blessed these unions, reinforcing the idea that divine will demanded royal blood should never be contaminated. By outsiders, the practice seemed harmless in the beginning after all. Who could challenge the power of united royal houses? Yet with every generation, the invisible danger grew. The gene pool shrank, and hidden weaknesses multiplied. The same royal features that symbolized majesty, high foreheads, sharp chins, pale skin, became exaggerated to grotesque proportions. One striking example lies in the Habsburg dynasty, where portraits reveal faces with unnaturally long jaws and protruding lips, a feature that became so common it earned the name the Habsburg jaw. To the people, these women appeared regal. To history, they reveal the cost of keeping crowns and power locked within the same blood. If the idea of marrying within your own family sounds unsettling today, imagine what it meant for royal daughters centuries ago. These young women grew up surrounded by tutors and priests who constantly reminded them of their sacred duty. They were not born to choose love, but to serve as pawns in a grand political game. Every marriage was a transaction signed, sealed, and announced like a treaty. A princess might be promised to her cousin before she was even out of the nursery. Sometimes, these arrangements were made without her ever meeting the man she would spend her life with. What mattered was not his kindness or his character, but his bloodline and the alliances it could secure. For many of these women, the wedding day felt less like a celebration and more like a sacrifice. Dressed in heavy gowns, embroidered with gold thread, they walked down the aisle not toward a partner, but toward a future already dictated by advisors and kings. The vows they spoke bound them not just to a husband, but to the continuation of a fragile family tree that had already begun to rot from the inside. Take the case of Maria Anna of Spain, who, in the 17th century, was forced to marry her own uncle, Ferdinand III of Austria. For her, the concept of family blurred with the obligations of monarchy. The marriage was celebrated as a triumph for political unity. But privately, Maria Anna entered a union that blurred the line between kinship and wedlock. To the royal court, it was strategy. To her, it was duty and, likely, quiet despair, and she was not alone. Countless princesses across Europe found themselves trapped in similar fates. Some were married off as teenagers to men decades older. Others were sent across borders to live in countries where they barely spoke the language. They carried the burden of leaving their childhood homes behind, only to enter palaces where their role was painfully clear: to bear heirs, to continue the dynasty, and to accept a life where personal happiness was rarely even considered. Behind the glittering wedding ceremonies, these women were silent actors in a repeating tragedy, while the world saw crowns, jewels, and divine blessings. What history reveals is far more somber: marriages that were never about love, but about preserving a bloodline that was slowly destroying itself. For these royal women, the wedding vows were only the beginning of their sacrifice. Their true duty, the one that defined their worth in the eyes of the court, was to produce heirs. Every pregnancy was celebrated as a political victory, every child a guarantee that the fragile chain of inheritance would not break. But beneath the celebrations lay a far darker reality. Each birth carried the risk of passing along the very weaknesses that centuries of inbreeding had planted deep within there. Bloodlines. Children were born pale, frail, and sickly. Some never made it beyond infancy. Others grew up plagued by deformities or illnesses that no physician could cure. To outsiders, these royal infants were the heirs of nations. To their mothers, they were fragile reminders of a cruel truth. The cost of keeping bloodlines pure was paid not only by the women, but by the children themselves. One of the most tragic examples is Charles II of Spain, often remembered as the Bewitched. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was his father's niece, making his genetic inheritance dangerously narrow. From the moment of his birth, Charles was weak and constantly ill. He suffered from epilepsy, severe developmental delays, and physical deformities that made it impossible for him to chew food properly. Despite being the most powerful monarch in name, he was so fragile that many in his court doubted he would even survive childhood. Imagine the burden this placed on the women of the family. Every time a queen or princess gave birth, she carried not only the fear of her own survival in an age when childbirth was perilous, but also the weight of dynastic expectation. A healthy son meant stability. A weak or sickly heir meant whispers, doubt, and sometimes open political unrest. For the mothers themselves, the emotional toll must have been crushing. They watched their children struggle with illnesses that were not random, misfortunes, but the predictable outcome of choices made generations earlier. To the outside world, they lived lives of silk and splendor. Inside the nursery, they lived lives of mourning, caring for children who bore the scars of royal ambition carved into their very bones. The cycle continued, each generation feeding the next, until the dynasty itself began to crack under the weight of its own blood. By the time the consequences of inbreeding became impossible to ignore, the royal courts had perfected the art of denial. Outwardly, the ceremonies continued with dazzling splendor, coronations bathed in gold, banquets lit by hundreds of candles, parades that displayed the might of the crown. But behind closed doors, the reality was much harder to disguise. Royal women often bore the heaviest burden of this secrecy. When their children were born weak or disfigured, whispers spread quickly through the palace. Some queens were quietly blamed for failing to provide strong heirs, as though their bodies alone carried the fault. Others were forced to hide the extent of their children's illnesses, shielding them from public appearances or masking their weakness with layers of makeup, heavy costumes. and stage displays of vitality, court physicians became experts at writing polished reports that glossed over harsh truths. If a young prince could not walk, his condition was described as a temporary stiffness. If a princess fainted constantly, it was excused as delicate nerves. But inside the royal chambers, mothers knew the truth. They were watching their families collapse from the inside. One telling case is that of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who gave birth to 16 children. Though some grew to be powerful rulers in their own right, many were plagued with fragile health and short lives. The sheer number of children concealed the tragic patterns. Several of them died young, and those who survived often carried the genetic weaknesses of the family. For Maria Theresa, each christening was followed too often by a funeral. Meanwhile, the outside world began to notice. Rival powers and common subjects alike whispered that the royal houses were cursed, that their divine blood was in fact tainted. For the women at the center of it all, the pressure was relentless. To keep smiling at court, to host grand balls, to appear as paragons of elegance, even as they mourned privately behind veils. The decline was not just physical but political. As dynasties produced weaker heirs, their ability to lead faltered. Royal women found themselves caught between two crushing realities, married into families that demanded absolute loyalty, and trapped in dynasties that were slowly unraveling under the very traditions meant to preserve them. What looked like a golden age from afar was, in truth, a fragile empire crumbling within its own gilded cages. All the warnings, all the whispered fears, finally erupted in one of the most tragic examples of inbreeding in history: the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs. At the center of this collapse stood Charles II of Spain, a man whose very body bore the weight of generations of intermarriage. His story is not simply that of a weak king, it is the embodiment of what happens when power and pride blind a family to the cost of their own traditions. Charles was the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who herself was his niece. By the time Charles was born, the royal family tree had folded in on itself so many times that it resembled a tangled knot. His genetic inheritance was dangerously narrow, and it showed in every part of his life. He could barely walk without help. His speech was slow and difficult to understand. His jaw was so misshapen that he could not properly chew his food. He was plagued by epilepsy, constant illness, and a mind clouded by both physical suffering and the crushing expectations of his title. The people called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, believing that no ordinary explanation could account for his frailty. And yet Charles was king. The fate of Spain rested on his shoulders, shoulders too weak to carry the burden. Royal women around him, from his mother to his wives, were forced into the impossible role of shielding him from the world's scrutiny, while also trying desperately to produce an heir. Both attempts failed. His marriages remained childless, and the once great Spanish Empire drifted toward ruin. The court could not hide the truth forever. Rumors swirled across Europe of a dynasty so corrupted by its own obsession with blood purity that it had destroyed itself. When Charles died in 1700 at just 38 years old, the Spanish Habsburg line ended with him. His body, frail and broken, was the final chapter of a family that had chosen power over health and tradition over survival. For the royal women bound to this legacy, the tragedy was doubly cruel. They had lived their lives obeying the commands of fathers, uncles, and kings, only to see the children they baranned, the dynasties they served, crumble into dust. The gilded palaces, the jeweled crowns, the endless ceremonies, all of it could not disguise the truth in their pursuit of purity. They had sown the seeds of their own destruction. The story of Charles II was not only the end of a king, but the final. Devastating proof that centuries of arranged unions and sacrificed women had created not strength, but fragility. It was the day a dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own blood. From the outside, history remembers the palaces, the crowns, and the portraits painted in oil and gold. But behind those portraits lived women who carried a burden far heavier than the jewels on their heads. They were celebrated as queens, empresses, and princesses, yet in reality, they were instruments of dynasties forced into marriages without love, bound to men who were also their kin, and made to bear children who would inherit both the throne and the hidden flaws of their lineage. The glittering halls of Versailles, Madrid, and Vienna seemed eternal, but their walls concealed quiet tragedies, young brides with broken hearts, mothers watching frail children slip away, and families slowly destroying themselves in the name of purity. It was not disease, famine, or war that toppled some of the greatest dynasties in Europe. It was their own obsession with bloodlines, a poison more dangerous than any enemy at the gate. And in the end, what remains? Portraits that now seem unsettling, records of marriages that read more like contracts than love stories, and the haunting tale of Charles II, the king who embodied the downfall of his family. His life was a warning written in flesh and blood, a story that reminds us how power, when clung to too tightly, can turn inward and consume itself. So the next time you see the gleaming crown of a queen, or the painted smile of a princess in some museum gallery, remember this: beneath the velvet gowns and golden crowns often lay a hidden truth, one of sacrifice, sorrow, and fragility. Because history is not always a story of glory. Sometimes it is the story of bloodlines turned against themselves, and the women who paid the price.